briefly a sort of second ago, we were talking sugar tax, which is a prime example of like a sort of a macro level policy decision maker. Right, we're gonna. Well, I think realistically that's done for like sort of two reasons really. One is you're taxing something to de-incentivise behaviour, but on the second hand you're also taxing it to generate income, and that's quite a very common economic policy, is to tax things you don't want, to discourage and to untax or alleviate tax and start with behaviours you want to encourage. Do those efforts for the most part, and this may completely vary depending on what type of policy is being implemented, do those policies for the most part, do they allow individuals to help maximise their utility more, or potentially do they disrupt their decision-making process and their ability to maximise?
Okay, so I can talk a lot about sugar taxes because
Right.
a lot of my colleagues and co-authors, they're involved with IFS and with Rachel Griffith, who were directly involved in these reforms in the UK.
Oh, right, okay.
So, but then the point is that these sugar taxes, if you just think about my utility today, my myopic utility, as an individual, they would hurt you.
Yeah.
Because you can't get your favorite drink or your favorite cake. It gets more expensive.
Sure.
But then if you start thinking about your utility over time, it might benefit you because it might push you to the healthier lifestyle.
Give you a nudge over. Yeah.
Exactly. And if you think from the perspective of the society, that's
it's a much better one.
So it was from some people in IFS, I remember the talk, and it was a comparison of sugar overconsumption and related obesity as being worse than smoking.
So sort of refined sugars is higher linked to obesity.
It was a very cynical reason. Smokers, they die young.
Ah, right.
You know, they scare you with cancer and everything, but most likely if you smoke a lot, you would die 60 from a heart attack.
Right.
You would not survive until the cancer.
Right, yeah.
So obese people, they live long.
Okay, interesting.
Because we have a lot of infrastructure
to help people with
obesity. To if it's diabetes, you get your insulin shots, and you can basically maintain the quality of life.
So is the medicine just more effective at tackling obesity than it is actually in terms of the effects of smoking then?
Yeah, and this effectiveness of medicine sort of makes makes it worse in terms of the costs for the society.
Right. Sure. Well, I mean, there's all that whole cynical view of like,
if you sit in the Ministry of Finance or something, you say, okay, I need to increase the spending of NHS because people just consume a lot of sugar, and then you think about that.
Well, I mean,
people will have to pay more taxes
in order to cope with that.
In order to cover for that. So why don't we just make people pay these taxes? A bit less, but before, to make sure that they don't consume that amount of sugar.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of, I guess, runs along the parallel. I know for the amount of A&E trips that I think it was the last study I read, it was something sort of like 51 to 54% were alcohol related in terms of that. I mean, that's a prime example, right? If people just didn't. That in a hypothetical, lovely, idealistic world, right, where nobody ever drank alcohol. You would have a situation where you'd have people sort of dying less often, which is longer, which is good, right? Work later, and then they're also reducing sort of the amount that you could save just from like NHS stuff which could then maybe be reallocated into something sort of more.
No, but that's exactly why there's the entire class of sin taxes, which is exactly about the hurting your utility maximization, but making sure that we try to reduce the load on a lot of sin taxes, and some people like put sugar to the class of the sin taxes. Is about reducing the load to the public health care.
Sure. So we'll keep with the sugar tax because that's where the knowledge base is in terms of the sin taxes. But is there? I mean, that's relatively recent. When did that?
It was several. I think it was less than 10 years ago.
Yeah, it wasn't. I remember it coming in with at least my sort of relatively.
It's quite a recent thing.
So, has there been any evidence? Because there's been a little bit of time now to show whether that has like positively affected.
So I think that it did. I don't think that the evidence was enough to study the obesity.
Right.
But then it did affect the sugar consumption. It indeed went down. But then in terms of obesity, the problem that it came as a package of measures. So for instance, they restricted significantly advertising of junk food.
Right.
And stuff like that. So
it's hard to isolate that as a
that's why just isolating the tax. I think that I've seen a paper from one of the researchers who is now in Switzerland. I'm not sure whether Lausanne or Zurich, and he was studying the same tax in Denmark, where it was isolated.
Oh, so they
yes,
just
they just did the sugar tax, and there it had a good effect.
Cool. Was it like of a great magnitude? I mean, it's one of those things where it's probably hard to isolate, I imagine, but did it have a great? Was it a small magnitude?
The problem here is that you cannot really. So here's a trade-off. Yeah, you can introduce an efficient. It's like with lockdown. The medical professional will tell you just keep them in their apartments, preferably forever.
Yes.
But then the business would say okay, and who'll pay for this?
Sure.
And the same with the sugar. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a.
Sugar is also about bakeries, restaurants, pubs, everything.
Because so the other side of the sin taxes thing, if you go around sort of heavily, let's say taxing, like ridiculously, let's say 100, 200% or whatever, suddenly, it has a diminishing returns, I guess, in terms of the scale.
And it just simply hurts the economy. Like the costs to the economy are higher than the benefits. Because what you gain in the healthcare benefit, you lose in the economic growth.